The pie was a statement of courage she did not feel. Lynn smoothed the front of her light pink prairie dress, the fabric a soft concession to a summer that demanded resilience. For 3 years since her husband Way had passed, her world had been painted in shades of functional gray and serviceable brown. Pink felt like a risk. So did the rhubarb pie, its lattice top glistening with a sugar glaze, its weight in her hands both a burden and an offering. The new neighbor, the one who had bought the old Miller ranch, had been there for a month, a silhouette of industry at the far edge of her property line. Mrs. Gable from town had been insistent. A man alone needs a neighbor, Lynn, and a neighbor needs to know she's not alone. It was the kind of practical logic that was impossible to argue with, even when every instinct Lynn had cultivated for survival screamed for quiet isolation. Her life was a carefully tended garden of solitude. She was not sure she wanted anyone peering over the fence. The pie, however, was an ambassador she could send in her place. It could say, "Welcome," without her having to commit to the sentiment herself. In her apron pocket, folded into a neat, worn square, was the other half of her life, a letter. It had arrived 2 days ago, the familiar, steady script, a balm against the world's abrasions. He signed his letters simply T.B. He was a man she had never met, a name connected to her by a discreet notice Mrs. Gable had pointed out in a gazette, a service for lonely souls seeking correspondence. He wrote of vast plains and the desire for roots, of the quiet satisfaction of a well-made fence, of a longing for a stillness he had never known. He was her secret, a world of feeling contained in ink and paper. He was thoughtful, articulate, and profoundly gentle. He was nothing, she assumed, like the man hammering posts into the hard summer earth next door. The pie was for the neighbor. The hope it represented, however, was for him. The walk between the two homesteads was not long, a quarter-mile path that wound through a stand of ponderosa pines that separated their lands. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sun-baked needles. She had learned, in the years of managing her small ranch alone, to read the land as a text. She knew the silence of midday, the rustle of a deer in the undergrowth, the way the light fractured through the canopy just before dusk. This path, however, felt unfamiliar under the weight of her mission. It was a bridge to an unknown quantity. Mrs. Gable had called him a cowboy, a man who had spent his life on the move and was now looking to settle. The word conjured an image of loud confidence, of a man who took up space, whose voice would be too large for her quiet kitchen. The man in the letters, T.B., took up space only in her mind, a welcome guest who never overstayed. He wrote of books he'd read by firelight and his clumsy attempts at growing tomatoes. Could a cowboy be clumsy with tomatoes? She shifted the pie in her hands, its warmth a reassurance. This was just a neighborly act, an exchange of civility. Nothing more needed to come of it. She would deliver the pie, offer a few pleasantries, and retreat back to her orderly world, where the only man she spoke to with any real honesty lived between the folds of a letter. As she neared the clearing, the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking wood grew louder, a steady, industrious heartbeat. It was a sound of beginning, of a life being built from scratch. She knew that sound. She had made it herself, repairing her own home, shoring up her own world against the encroaching wilderness. It was the sound of stubborn survival. For a moment, she felt a kinship with the stranger, this shared language of labor. Then the feeling passed, replaced by a familiar caution. She stopped at the edge of the trees, took a breath, and stepped into the sunlight. He was driving a fence post, his back to her. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a chambray shirt faded by the sun to the color of a pale sky. He moved with an economy of motion she recognized, the kind that came from years of physical work where no energy could be wasted. He did not look like a man of loud confidence. He looked like a man at work. She cleared her throat, a small, inadequate sound against the vastness of the afternoon. He stilled, the hammer held mid-swing. He turned slowly, and her first thought was that his eyes were tired. Not weary, but settled, as if they had seen enough of wide open spaces and were glad for a smaller view. He had a plain, honest face, his features arranged in a way that suggested consideration rather than quick judgment. He was not what she had expected, but then she hadn't truly known what to expect. He looked at her, then at the pie, and a flicker of something, confusion, surprise, crossed his face. "Ma'am?" he said. His voice was low and carried a slight roughness, like stones in a slow-moving creek. "I didn't hear you approach." She managed a small smile. "I tried not to. It feels impolite to startle a man holding a hammer." A ghost of a smile touched his own lips, so brief she might have imagined it. "Fair point." He set the heavy mallet down carefully and wiped his hands on his trousers, a gesture of ingrained courtesy. "I'm Lynn, from the next ranch over," she said, stepping forward. "I thought, well, I brought you this, as a welcome." She held out the pie. He looked at it as if it were a strange and delicate artifact. He took a step closer, his gaze direct. "You didn't have to do that." "It's just rhubarb," she said, feeling the need to diminish the offering, to make it as small and insignificant as possible. A neighborly gesture. He reached for it, his hands large and calloused, but surprisingly gentle as they took the dish from hers. For a moment, their fingers brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting contact, but it felt like a current passing between them. "Thomas Bell," he said, his eyes still on her face. "I'm grateful." The conversation that followed was built of small, practical things: the depth of his well, the tenacity of the weeds, the promise of rain in the clouds massing to the west. He spoke little, offering observations rather than opinions, asking questions that required simple answers. He was, she thought, a man who listened more than he spoke. It was a quality she admired, but it stood in such stark, jarring contrast to the eloquent soul who filled pages with his thoughts and sent them to her from a post office box in Prescott. Thomas Bell was a man of fences and weather. T.B. was a man of feelings and philosophies. Her mind could not reconcile the two. She felt a pang of disappointment, a foolish, childish ache for a reality that had never been promised. This man, this Thomas Bell, was her neighbor. He was real. The man in the letters was a dream. She had to remember that. "Your place is well kept," he said, looking past her toward her neat barn and tidy garden rows. "You manage it alone?" "I do," she said. There was no pity in his gaze, only a quiet respect that she found herself appreciating more than she expected. "It's good land." He nodded, agreeing. "It is. It's the reason I stopped here. Felt like a place a man could put down roots." The phrase was so close to something T.B. had written in his last letter. A man spends his life wandering, looking for the one patch of ground that tells him he's home, that she felt a physical jolt. It was a common sentiment, of course, a universal longing. It meant nothing. She tucked the stray thought away, chiding herself for her romantic foolishness. "Well, I should let you get back to your work," she said, taking a step back toward the path. "Enjoy the pie." "I will," he said, and his gaze held hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Thank you, Lynn." The sound of her name in his quiet voice was strangely intimate. She simply nodded and turned, walking back toward the familiar shade of the pines, her carefully constructed composure feeling as fragile as a robin's egg. She had done the neighborly thing. Now she could return to her life and to the letters from a man who understood her, a man who was nothing like the quiet, watchful cowboy next door. Weeks bled into a month, and the summer settled into a rhythm of long, hot days and cool, star-dusted nights. A strange duality took hold of Lynn's life. By day, there was Thomas Bell. He was a steady, quiet presence at the edge of her world. He didn't impose, but he was there. One morning she found the handle on her water pump, which had been stubbornly loose for a year, repaired and solid. There was no note. Another afternoon, after a trip to town, she returned to find a small stack of freshly split kindling on her porch. In return, she left a jar of wild plum preserves by his door, and once a loaf of bread, still warm from the oven. Their interactions were a currency of deeds, not words. They would sometimes speak over the fence line, their conversations brief and anchored to the earth. The health of his new horse, the threat of grasshoppers, the progress of his small cabin. He was, she discovered, possessed of a dry, infrequent humor that took her by surprise and made her smile when she wasn't expecting to. And then, by night, there was T.B. His letters continued to arrive, a secret stream feeding a hidden part of her soul. He wrote of his struggles and small triumphs in building his new life, his description so vivid she felt she was a silent witness. He described the frustration of a crookedly hung door and the simple joy of watching a hawk circle in the vast blue sky. He wrote of his own past, of a loss that mirrored her own, a shared grief that he articulated with a raw honesty that made her weep. She wrote back, her own reserve melting away onto the page. She told him of Way, of her fears and her small joys, of the crushing loneliness that sometimes descended in the quiet hours after sunset. With T.B., she was utterly known. With Thomas, she was a neighbor. The two men could not have been more different. One was a poet, the other a post driver. One evening Mrs. Gable stopped by, her eyes twinkling with a knowing light. "That Mr. Bell seems a decent sort," she said, accepting a glass of lemonade. "Quiet, hard worker." "He is," Lynn agreed, offering nothing more. "A man like that," Mrs. Gable continued, as if inspecting the rim of her glass, "is probably better with his hands than he is with words." Lynn felt a flush of defensiveness on behalf of her secret correspondent, the man who was so good with words. "Some men are good with both," she said quietly. Mrs. Gable just smiled. "Perhaps, but it's the ones who are good with their hands you can count on to fix a pump." The storm arrived without warning, as they often did in late August. One moment the sky was a placid, hazy blue. The next, it was a bruised purple, the air growing heavy and electric. Lynn had been securing the chickens in their coop when the first fat drops of rain began to fall, turning the dust in the yard to dark, spreading stains. Then the heavens opened. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet, driven by a wind that tore at the pines, making them groan like dying giants. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that rattled the windows of her small house. She stood in her kitchen, watching the world dissolve into a gray chaos, a familiar anxiety tightening its grip on her chest. Storms always made her feel the full weight of her solitude. It was in moments like these that the house felt too big, the silence inside a poor defense against the fury outside. A sudden, violent crack, louder than the thunder, made her jump. Through the deluge, she saw it. A massive pine at the edge of her pasture had been struck by lightning, one of its huge limbs torn away, landing perilously close to the corner of her barn. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Before she could even process the danger, a figure emerged from the maelstrom. It was Thomas, his hat pulled low, his coat plastered to his frame, moving with a determined stride through the driving rain. He wasn't running, but walking with a purpose that seemed to defy the storm itself. He came straight to her door and knocked, the sound firm and reassuring against the howling wind. She pulled it open. He stood on her porch, dripping, water streaming from the brim of his hat. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. "I saw the strike." "I'm fine," she said, her own voice unsteady. "The barn—" "I saw," he nodded. "It missed, but I wanted to be sure." He looked past her into the warm, dry kitchen, then back at her. The silence that stretched between them was no longer awkward or strained. It was filled with the roar of the storm, but it was a silence of shared presence, of one person simply showing up for another. "Come in," she said, stepping back. "Wait for it to pass." He hesitated for only a second before stepping over the threshold, bringing the scent of rain and wet earth into her home. He accepted a cup of coffee, holding the warm mug in his large hands as if it were a small, precious animal. He took off his hat and set it by the door, his damp hair clinging to his forehead. They sat at her small kitchen table, the storm raging outside, creating a strange pocket of stillness within the house. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the drumming of rain on the roof, the whistle of the wind, and the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Lynn had expected the silence to be uncomfortable, a void she would need to fill with polite chatter. Instead, it was companionable. It was the quiet of two people who understood that some things required no words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and reflective. "I used to hate storms on the trail," he said, staring into his cup. "Nowhere to go. Just had to turn your back to the wind and endure it." He looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the table. "It's different, having a roof. Walls." He paused, searching for the right words. "It makes a man feel less temporary." He spoke of his life before, of the endless movement, the loneliness of a crowded cattle drive, the feeling of always passing through. He didn't complain. He stated it as fact, as a season of his life that was now over. "I was tired of it," he said simply. "Tired of having no place to come home to." As he spoke, Lynn felt the carefully constructed wall inside her begin to crumble. The man sitting across from her, his speech so plain and unadorned, was speaking the very language of her heart, the same deep-seated longing for permanence and peace that T.B. wrote about with such poetic grace. They were not the same, and yet the core of them, the fundamental truth of their desires, seemed to run in a single unwavering line. The man of deeds and the man of words were both seeking the same shelter. The storm began to subside, the thunder moving off into the distance, the rain softening to a steady, gentle drumming. The world outside was washed clean, the air fresh and cool. The quiet that settled in the kitchen now was different, deeper. It was the quiet of a shared understanding, a recognition that had passed between them without a single explicit word. He had shown up. In the midst of the storm, he had walked through the rain just to be sure she was safe. A week later, the letter arrived. It was thicker than usual. Inside, T.B. wrote about the storm. He described the visceral fear he felt when he saw the lightning strike so close to her property, the primal protective instinct that had propelled him out into the rain. "It was not a thought," he wrote, "but a certainty. I had to know you were safe. In that moment, the distance between my land and yours felt vast and unbearable. All I wanted was to close it." He went on, writing of a future he was beginning to allow himself to imagine, a future that felt like coming home to a place I had only ever visited in my dreams. He wrote of the hope that the person he corresponded with might one day be more than just words on a page. The letter left Lynn breathless. She read it 3 times, her hands trembling. The next afternoon, Thomas came over to help her stack the firewood from the fallen pine limb. They worked together in a comfortable, practiced silence, passing the logs from one to the other, building a neat, sturdy wall against the coming winter. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows, the air crisp with the first hint of autumn. As he set the last piece of wood in place, Thomas straightened up and looked toward the mountains. his profile etched against the golden light. "I like this time of day best," he said, his voice quiet. "The way the light hits the pines makes everything look peaceful." It was the phrase, not just the sentiment, but the specific, almost lyrical observation. A phrase an artist might use, or a poet, or a man who paid very close attention to the world and had a gift for describing it. "The light on the pines in the late afternoon is a kind of prayer," T.B. had written in a letter months ago. It was a thunderclap in the quiet of her mind. Everything shifted. The two parallel lines of her life suddenly, violently converging. She looked at him, at this quiet, capable man, his hands stained with pine resin, his face open and unguarded as he watched the sunset. She saw the way his thumb traced the grain of the wood, the thoughtful set of his jaw. She imagined those same hands holding a pen, moving carefully across a sheet of paper late at night by the light of a single lamp. It was impossible. It was the only thing that made sense. She went inside and returned with a glass of water, her heart beating a frantic, unsteady rhythm. He took it with a grateful nod, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled his thanks. In her apron pocket, her fingers found the folded edges of his latest letter. The paper felt warm against her skin, a living thing. She watched him drink, the simple, necessary act of a thirsty man. All the complicated feelings, the years of solitude, the secret hopes, all of it seemed to crystallize into this single, terrifying, beautiful moment. She had to know. But she could not ask a direct question. It was too brutal, too much like an accusation. The truth needed to be invited, not forced. She took a breath. "You have a way with words, Mr. Bell," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "when you choose to use them." He stopped, the glass halfway to his lips. He lowered it slowly, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. The question was there, hanging in the space between them, clear and sharp. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not deception, but a deep and profound shyness, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. The quiet cowboy and the eloquent correspondent were one and the same. There was no confusion left, only the stunning, world-altering fact of it. He looked down at the ground, then back at her, his expression one of sober honesty. "I'm not," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not when I'm face to face. The words get stuck somewhere between my head and my mouth." He gestured vaguely toward his cabin. On paper it's different. I can take my time. I can say what I actually mean." He finally revealed the rest of the story, of his own wife, lost to a fever years ago, and the profound isolation that had followed. The correspondence service had been a desperate act, a way to connect with another soul without having to face his own inadequacy with spoken words. He had never intended for his correspondent to be his next-door neighbor. He had thought Lynn was a woman in a different town, a safe distance away. When he saw her on his doorstep, holding a pie, he had nearly given himself away. "I was afraid," he confessed, the admission costing him dearly. "Afraid you'd be disappointed. The man in the letters, he's better than I am." "No," she said, her voice soft but certain. "He's not." The truth, once spoken, settled over them not with the weight of revelation, but with the lightness of relief. The two separate men Lynn had known, the quiet neighbor who fixed her pump, and the soulful correspondent who fixed her loneliness, merged into one. There was no longer a division between the man of deeds and the man of words. They were both Thomas Bell, and he was standing in her yard, looking at her as if she held the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask his entire life. He had shown her both sides of himself, the practical, capable man who could build a life with his hands, and the thoughtful, vulnerable man who could build a world with his words. He had given her all of him without even realizing it. Thomas, she said, the name feeling new and right on her tongue. He looked up, startled, as if hearing it for the first time. You never have to be afraid of disappointing me. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unburdened smile that transformed his entire countenance. It reached his tired eyes and filled them with a light she had not seen there before. The tension that he seemed to carry in his shoulders eased. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another, until he was standing before her. He didn't reach for her, didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his gratitude and his hope a palpable presence in the cooling air. I kept all your letters, he said quietly. I did too, she whispered. The unspoken words hung between them. They were the truest part of us. Now we can be true. In that moment, the love that had grown in the abstract space of ink and paper found its physical home. It wasn't a sudden, passionate flame, but the steady, reliable warmth of a hearth fire, carefully built and tended over time. It was a love that had been chosen twice, once on the page, in the darkness of solitude, and now again, face to face, in the golden light of a summer evening. He had closed the distance. He had walked through the storm. He was home. Autumn arrived, painting the forest in hues of gold and amber. The days grew shorter, the nights sharper, and the steady rhythm of their lives became a shared one. The fence line that had once separated their properties was now just a landmark, a line on a map of a shared territory. More often than not, they ate their evening meals together, sometimes at her table, sometimes at his. His cabin, once a stark shelter, was now a home, softened by the addition of curtains she had sewn and a braided rug she had placed before the fireplace. One evening they sat on his porch, a blanket shared across their laps, watching the first stars appear in the deep indigo sky. He was holding one of her first letters, reading it aloud, his voice warm with a gentle amusement. You wrote here, he said, that you suspected your new neighbor was a man likely to own a very loud dog and a poor opinion of rhubarb pie. She laughed, a sound that felt easy and frequent now. I was wrong on both counts. Thank goodness for that, he said, folding the letter carefully and tucking it back into its envelope. He had a small tin box where he kept all of them. It sat on his mantelpiece, a testament to the unlikely bridge that had brought them together. The narration of their lives had merged. The quiet acts of service and the eloquent expressions of feeling were no longer separate tracks. They were a single, harmonious story. He still fixed things with his hands, and she still found comfort and joy in his quiet, steady presence. And he still wrote to her, not letters sent from town, but notes left on the kitchen table, small observations or declarations of affection tucked into her apron pocket, continuing the language that had first taught them how to speak to one another. The stars overhead were distant, ancient, and patient. They had watched empires rise and fall, mountains turn to dust. Against their cosmic time scale, a human life was a fleeting, desperate spark. But, she thought, leaning her head against his shoulder, that was precisely the point. The universe had all the time in the world, but people did not. And that was why it was so important to act, to bake the pie, to write the letter, to walk through the storm, to cross the small distance between one lonely heart and another, and to have the courage to say, "Come in."